No man's touched me since 1850. A lonely cabin flickers with lamplight as an older frontier widow grips her skillet, staring down a stranger at her door. 30 years alone. And now, a young mountain man smiles, then dares to step inside. Snow beats against the walls. The wolves howl outside. But the real danger isn't the storm. It's the railroad men who want her land, the crooked deputy with a stolen Bible, and the town that whispers she's a fool for letting him stay. Yet in the quiet, he mends her stove, hauls her water, and reads the good book by firelight. A bond forms where no one thought it could, and just when hope warms her heart, the law comes with chains, tearing them apart. Now, faith and dignity are all she has left, while secrets, allies, and enemies close in. Will a woman who vowed never to be touched again risk everything for a final chance at love, justice, and belonging? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes across the Colorado highlands, coating the winter bare branches and turning the dusk sky an eerie gray. Dale Merrick pulled his worn coat tighter around his broad shoulders, watching his breath cloud in the frigid air. His boots crunched through the fresh powder as he scanned the darkening landscape for any sign of shelter. 20 years in the mountains had taught him to read weather like most men read books, and everything about this storm warned of a bitter night ahead. The wind cut sharp across his weathered face, carrying the bite of deeper cold to come. His fingers, though protected by leather gloves, had started to grow stiff around his Winchester rifle. Lord willing, there's somewhere ahead, he muttered, adjusting the bedroll slung across his back. The last rays of sun were fading fast, painting long shadows between the towering pines. Dale knew better than to be caught in the open on a night like this, the kind that could freeze a man solid before dawn. Then he saw it, a faint golden glow through the thickening snow. Hope stirred in his chest as he made out the dim shape of a cabin tucked against the tree line. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, barely visible against the stormy sky. Dale approached cautiously, not wanting to startle whoever dwelled within. The cabin was sturdy, but showed its age. Weather-grayed logs chinked with mud, a patched roof, and a small vegetable patch now buried under snow. Someone lived here year-round, someone who knew how to survive in these harsh mountains. As he drew closer, he could make out more details through the cabin's single window. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows. A figure moved inside, someone tending the flames. Dale stopped at the wooden door and knocked firmly, snow falling from his shoulders. For a long moment, there was only silence broken by the whisper of wind through pine boughs. Then came the sound of footsteps, hesitant and light. The door creaked open just enough to reveal a woman's face, lined with years, but still handsome. Her gray-streaked hair pulled back severely from sharp features. Her eyes, dark and suspicious, studied him from the narrow gap. In her weathered hands, she gripped a heavy iron skillet like a weapon. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice rough with disuse but carrying a note of steel. Dale kept his posture relaxed, non-threatening, though he noted how capable those hands looked on that skillet. "Evening, ma'am. I'm caught out in this storm and looking for shelter till morning. I'd be much obliged for a spot by your fire." Her eyes narrowed, taking in his trail-worn appearance, the rifle, the bedroll, the simple clothes of a mountain man. "You're a long way from anywhere, mister." "Yes, ma'am. I surely am." He offered a slight smile, careful to keep his hands visible and away from his weapon. "Dale Merrick's my name. I've been working my way through these parts, doing odd jobs. Where I can find them." The woman's grip tightened on her skillet. Something flashed in her eyes, fear mixed with a fierce pride. "I'm Maggie Keene, and I don't take in strangers. Especially not men." Her voice rose suddenly, sharp and defensive. "No man's touched me since 1850, and that's how it's staying. The declaration hung in the snowy air between them, startling in its intensity. Dale felt the weight of old pain behind those words, a story of loss or betrayal that had left deep scars. But he only smiled gently, understanding in his eyes. Mrs. Keen, I give you my word as a Christian man. I'm only asking for warmth and shelter from the storm. Nothing more. Maggie studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The wind gusted harder, driving snow through the gap in the door. Finally, something in Dale's steady gaze seemed to reach her. Her shoulders dropped slightly, though she kept her grip on the skillet. You can come in, she said reluctantly, but keep your distance and don't try anything foolish. I've lived alone up here for 28 years, and I know how to handle trouble. Yes, ma'am, Dale replied softly. Much obliged. She stepped back, opening the door just enough for him to enter. The cabin's interior was spare but neat, a few pieces of simple furniture, shelves lined with preserved food, and bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Everything spoke of careful husbandry and solitude. Dale moved slowly to the hearth, keeping his movements measured and predictable. He set his rifle carefully by the door, then unwrapped his snow-covered coat and hung it on a peg. Maggie watched his every move, still holding the skillet as she positioned herself on the far side of the room. The fire's warmth began to seep into Dale's cold, numbed fingers as he settled onto a rough-hewn stool. Across the hearth, Maggie finally lowered her makeshift weapon and sank into her rocking chair, though her posture remained alert and wary. The flames cast dancing shadows across both their faces as silence filled the cabin. Dale could feel the weight of decades of solitude in that silence. He recognized it, the wariness of someone who'd learned to trust only themselves, the defensive walls built by the years of isolation. He'd carried similar walls himself since that bitter land swindle back in Wyoming. But there was something else here too, something that had made him knock on this particular door instead of settling for a snow cave. Maybe it was the lamplight that had beckoned through the storm, or maybe it was the Lord's own guidance. Whatever the reason, he felt an odd sense of peace despite the tension in the room. The fire crackled softly as snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in white. Neither of them spoke, but the silence gradually shifted from suspicious to something almost comfortable. Two lonely souls sharing warmth on a cold mountain night, each carrying their own burdens, their own reasons for choosing solitude. Maggie's hands had settled in her lap, no longer reaching for the skillet. Her eyes still watched Dale, but some of the sharp wariness had faded. Perhaps she saw in him what he recognized in her, someone who understood the language of isolation, who knew the cost of trust betrayed. The storm howled outside, rattling the cabin's windows and driving snow against the walls. But inside, the fire held back the darkness, its warmth creating a small circle of light where two strangers sat in cautious companionship. Neither knowing that this night would mark the beginning of a story neither had expected to find. Dale watched the flames dance, sensing that any attempt at conversation now would only rebuild the walls he could see slowly lowering. Sometimes silence spoke louder than words, and tonight it spoke of possibility, of trust that might grow like early spring flowers through mountain snow, if given time and gentle tending. So they sat, these two solitary souls, while the fire burned low and the storm raged outside, each lost in their own thoughts, yet somehow less alone than they had been when the evening began. The old cabin creaked and settled around them, a shelter against more than just the winter wind, as the night drew its quiet curtain over the Colorado highlands. Dawn crept over the Colorado mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Inside Maggie's cabin, Dale stirred from his makeshift bed near the hearth, careful not to wake his reluctant hostess. The fire had burned low during the night, and the morning air held a bitter chill. He eased the cabin door open, wincing at its soft creak. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of white. His experienced eye noted Maggie's depleted woodpile against the cabin wall. Without hesitation, he retrieved the axe he'd spotted the previous evening and set to work. The rhythmic thud of steel against wood filled the crisp morning air. Dale's breath came out in white puffs as he split log after log, building a neat stack. The physical labor warmed his muscles and gave him time to think. This lonely cabin and its fiercer owner had stirred something in him, a desire to be useful, to prove himself trustworthy. Inside the cabin, Maggie woke to unfamiliar sounds. She lay still for a moment, listening intently, then grabbed her skillet before approaching the window. The sight that greeted her made her lower the improvised weapon slowly. Dale's tall figure moved with steady purpose, adding another split log to the growing pile. His actions were efficient, practiced, the movements of a man who knew hard work. Maggie watched him, her weathered features softening slightly. It had been so long since anyone had done something for her without being asked. When Dale returned inside, arms loaded with wood, he found Maggie stirring up the fire. She acknowledged him with a brief nod, her guard still visible but less rigid than the night before. "Didn't ask you to do that," she said gruffly, though there was less edge to her voice than before. "No, ma'am, you didn't." Dale stacked the wood neatly by the hearth. But it needed doing. As Maggie began preparing a simple breakfast, Dale's attention was drawn to her old cook stove. His keen eye noticed a crack running along its side, poorly patched with clay that was crumbling away. "Your stove's got a bad crack, Mrs. Keen," he observed carefully, not wanting to offend. "I could fix that proper if you got some wire and scrap iron about." Maggie's hands stilled over the cornmeal she was measuring. "Been meaning to patch it myself," she said defensively. Then, after a pause, "There's some old wire in the lean-to out back. Bit of iron, too, from when—" She stopped abruptly, her face closing off. Dale pretended not to notice her sudden silence. He retrieved the materials and set to work, his skilled hands carefully cleaning away the old patch. As he worked, he could feel Maggie watching him while she prepared the cornbread. The morning passed quietly as Dale repaired the stove, the silence broken only by the soft sounds of his work and Maggie's cooking. The aroma of fresh cornbread gradually filled the cabin, mingling with the sharp scent of coffee brewing. Finally, Dale sat back, surveying his handiwork. The crack was now sealed with a neat patch of iron, secured with carefully twisted wire. "That should hold better than clay," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Won't leak heat now." Maggie examined his work with critical eyes. "Been a long time since I've seen a proper repair job," she admitted, finally. Something shifted in her expression, a memory rising unbidden. "Thomas, my husband, he was never much good with his hands, always chasing dreams instead of tending to what needed doing." She turned away abruptly, busying herself with a coffee pot, but Dale caught the flash of old pain in her eyes. He waited quietly, sensing there was more to come. "Went off to California in 1850, she continued, her voice tight with long-held bitterness. "Said he'd send for me once he struck it rich, never did. Never even wrote to say if he was dead or alive." She set 2 tin cups down with more force than necessary. "I learned to manage on my own. Don't need any man's help now." "No, ma'am, that's plain to see," Dale replied carefully. "But sometimes it's not about needing help. Sometimes it's just about sharing the load because we're meant to be neighborly." Maggie glanced at him sharply, but whatever she saw in his face seemed to ease something in her. She wordlessly placed a plate of hot cornbread on the table. They ate their simple breakfast in companionable silence. The morning sun streamed through the window, catching the steam rising from their coffee cups. Finally, Dale spoke, his voice thoughtful. "Been traveling these parts for a while now," he said, breaking off a piece of cornbread. "Seen some troubling things. Railroads pushing through, buying up land or taking it when folks won't sell." Maggie's hand tightened on her cup. "What do you mean, taking it?" Dale met her eyes steadily. "They've got surveyors marking routes, deputies backing their claims. Been forcing settlers off their land, legal deed or no. Saw it happen over in South Park last month." My land's been deeded proper since 1848, Maggie said, rising too. Retrieve a worn document from a tin box on the shelf. She spread it carefully on the table, her fingers tracing the faded writing. Paid for fair and square. Dale studied the deed carefully, noting the official seals and signatures. It's legal, right enough, he confirmed. But railroad men don't always care about legal. You might want to prepare yourself for trouble. Maggie's face hardened with determination. Let them try. I've held this land alone for 28 years. Not about to give it up now. The day passed with Dale finding small tasks to occupy himself, mending a loose shutter, patching a hole in the roof he'd spotted. Maggie didn't object, though she watched him with a mixture of wariness and growing curiosity. As evening approached, they sat again by the fire, the repaired stove radiating steady warmth. Dale noticed Maggie's Bible on the shelf, its leather cover worn smooth with age. Would, you mind, if I read some? He asked, gesturing to the book. Been a while since I've had the chance. Maggie hesitated, then nodded. Dale retrieved the Bible carefully, handling it with obvious respect. His voice, deep and steady, filled the cabin as he read from the Book of Psalms. The familiar words took on new meaning in the quiet space between them. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Maggie's hand stilled in her lap as she listened. Something in Dale's voice, warm and sincere, seemed to reach past her carefully maintained walls. She found herself relaxing into her chair, letting the words wash over her like a gentle rain on parched earth. The fire crackled softly as Dale continued reading, the ancient promises of comfort and protection finding new life in the gathering dusk. Outside, the mountain night was settling in, but inside the cabin, something was slowly warming besides the repaired stove. A cautious trust, born of respect freely given and work done without demand for thanks. Dale's voice continued steady and sure in the lamplight, while Maggie sat quiet in her rocker, her face softened by shadows and perhaps by something more than just the day's unexpected kindness. The morning dawned crisp and clear, frost etching delicate patterns on the cabin's small windows. Dale rose early again, his movements quiet so as not to disturb Maggie. He pulled on his boots and heavy coat, then slipped outside to begin the day's work. The creek ran swift and cold through the property, its banks rimmed with ice. Dale broke through the frozen edges with his bucket, the sound sharp in the still morning air. The water was numbingly cold as he filled the containers, but he worked steadily, making multiple trips to fill Maggie's storage barrels. From her window, Maggie watched him trudge back and forth through the snow, her hands twisted in her apron, pride warring with practical need. When Dale finally came inside, his coat crusted with ice, she wordlessly handed him a steaming cup of coffee. Didn't ask for help, she muttered, though her tone lacked its usual edge. No, ma'am. Dale wrapped his cold hands around the warm cup. But winter's hard enough without having to. Haul water alone. Maggie's fence line needed attention next. Several posts had worked loose in the frozen ground, and sections of wire hung slack between them. Dale gathered his tools and set to work, driving the posts deeper and tightening the wire. The physical labor warmed him despite the cold air. Maggie emerged from the cabin around midday, carrying a plate with thick slices of bread and salt pork. She stood watching as Dale hammered a post straight, his breaths clouding in the winter air. "You'll work better with something in your stomach," she said gruffly, holding out the plate. Dale wiped his hands on his pants and accepted the offering with a nod of thanks. They ate together on an old stump, the winter sun weak but bright overhead. A few of Maggie's chickens scratched hopefully in the snow nearby. "Hens ain't laying much these days," Maggie commented, watching the birds. "Cold's got into their bones, I reckon. Might help to shore up their coop a bit," Dale suggested. "Saw some gaps in the boards where the wind gets through." Maggie's shoulders stiffened slightly. "Been meaning to fix that myself." "Yes, ma'am. I'm sure you have." Dale's voice held no judgment. "But an extra pair of hands makes quick work of it." The afternoon found them working together on the chicken coop. Dale handled the heavier repairs while Maggie passed him tools and held boards in place. Her movements were stiff with age, though she tried to hide it. Dale pretended not to notice when she needed to rest, instead taking those moments to share his own stories of life in the mountains. As evening approached, they returned to the cabin's warmth. Maggie prepared a simple supper of beans and the last of the salt pork, while Dale cleaned up from the day's work. The familiar domestic sounds filled the small space. Spoon against pot, water in the basin, wood settling in the stove. They sat down to eat, the lamp casting warm light across the worn table. After several quiet moments, Dale spoke, his voice thoughtful. "Used to work with a trapping outfit up in the Rockies," he said, breaking off a piece of bread. "Good men, most of them. Taught me everything I know about surviving in the wild." Maggie listened silently, noting the shadow that crossed his face. "Had a chance at some land up there," he continued. "Partner and I pooled our money to buy a nice piece of valley. Good water rights, prime grazing." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Found out too late the deed was worthless. Partner had taken our money and run, left me holding nothing but paper." "Some men are like that," Maggie said quietly, thinking of Thomas and his golden dreams. Dale nodded. "Been wandering since then. Easier to keep moving than to stay put and trust folks again." He gave a rueful smile. "Though I reckon running from memories ain't much of a life either." Maggie studied him across the table, seeing past his youth to the weight he carried. Here was someone else who understood betrayal, who knew how it could hollow out a person's faith in others. The quiet of their meal was suddenly broken by a long, mournful howl. Maggie's head snapped up, her face tightening with worry. "Wolves," she said tersely. "They've been getting bold lately, coming closer to the cabin." Another howl sounded, closer this time. Dale was already reaching for his rifle, moving toward the door. Outside, the moon cast sharp shadows across the snow, and the wind carried the sound of frightened chickens. Dale's eyes scanned the darkness, catching movement near the coop. The wolf's gray form was barely visible in the gloom, but his aim was steady. The rifle crack split the night, deliberately high, meant to frighten rather than kill. The wolf disappeared into the darkness, followed by the sound of running paws in the snow. The chicken coop gradually quieted as the hens settled. "Wasting good powder," Maggie scolded, though there was a hint of amusement in her voice. "Could have just banged a pot." Dale lowered his rifle, grinning. "Maybe so, but this way they'll think twice before coming back." Unexpectedly, Maggie laughed, a rusty sound, as if long unused. Dale joined in, and for a moment the years of loneliness seemed to lift from her shoulders. Back inside, they prepared for night. Maggie added wood to the stove while Dale spread his blanket near the hearth. The familiar routine had lost its awkwardness, settling into something almost comfortable. "I'll be locking my door," Maggie said firmly, as she did every night. "Yes, ma'am," Dale replied, as he always did. "Sleep well." Maggie retreated to her bedroom, the lock clicking firmly into place. But instead of going straight to bed, she sank to her knees beside it, her hands clasped together, trembling slightly. "Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "it's been a long time since I've talked to you proper. Didn't see much point after everything." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But I reckon maybe I ought to say thank you for sending someone to help an old woman who's too proud to ask for it." The prayer felt rusty, like her laugh had been, but it eased something in her chest that had been tight for years. Outside her door, the fire crackled softly, and Dale's quiet breathing joined the familiar night sounds of her cabin. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Maggie fell asleep without feeling quite so alone. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the Colorado highlands. Dale stood in the yard, squinting up at Maggie's roof. Patches of worn shingles showed clearly against the thin morning light, and several spots sagged ominously under their burden of snow. "Those shingles won't last another storm," he called to Maggie, who stood wrapped in her shawl at the cabin door. "Best we fix them before the next snow comes." Maggie pressed her lips together, studying the roof she'd been ignoring for too long. "Ain't got proper materials," she said finally. "Saw some cedar by the creek, that'll do fine," Dale replied, already reaching for his axe. "Won't take but a day to split enough shakes." "Suppose you know all about roofing, too." Maggie's voice held a trace of her usual sharpness, though her eyes showed worry as she gazed upward. Dale smiled. "Yes, ma'am. Learned from necessity, same as most things out here." The morning air bit cold as Dale made his way toward the creek bottom, where he'd spotted the cedar trees. His breath fogged in front of him as he walked. Axe balanced easily on his shoulder. The snow crunched beneath his boots, and overhead, a lone crow called harshly against the winter silence. He was studying a likely cedar when movement caught his eye. There, just within the tree line, stood a man watching him. The observer made no attempt to hide, standing straight and still in the traditional dress of the Apache, though he also wore a wool blanket against the cold. Dale lowered his axe slowly and raised his empty hand in greeting. "Good morning, friend." The man stepped forward with fluid grace, his dark eyes alert but not unfriendly. "I am called Nantan," he said, his English clear and measured. "Dale Merrick," Dale responded with a respectful nod. "You're welcome to walk with me if you've a mind to." Nantan moved closer, his moccasins silent on the snow. "You stay at the widow's cabin." It wasn't a question, but Dale answered anyway. "Yes, helping with some repairs before winter sets in proper." "The woman has lived alone many seasons," Nantan observed, proud. "But age makes the work harder." From the cabin, Maggie watched their exchange with growing tension. Her hand gripped the doorframe as Nantan walked beside Dale toward the house. Years of town gossip and prejudice warred with what she was seeing. Two men speaking as equals in her yard. Dale's voice carried clearly. "Ms. Keene, this here's Nantan. He's been kind enough to share some news about the railroad men." Nantan inclined his head respectfully. "Your land lies in their path, widow. They have been marking boundaries these past days." His expression grew grave. "It is contested ground now." Maggie's spine stiffened. "Got my deed right here in the cabin. Legal and proper." "Paper means little to such men," Nantan said quietly. "They have their own paper, their own laws." He adjusted his blanket, the movement deliberate and dignified. "My people know this well." A bitter taste rose in Maggie's throat as she remembered how the townspeople spoke of the Apache, with fear and dismissal. Yet here stood a man offering her fair warning, showing more neighborly concern than she'd seen in years. "Much obliged for the warning," she said finally, her voice rough with emotion she couldn't quite name. Nantan nodded. "If trouble comes, you have friends closer than the town." His eyes met Dale's briefly. "The railroad men do not know these hills as we do." The offer of alliance hung in the air, unexpected and powerful. Maggie found herself blinking back tears she hadn't expected. "Would you take coffee?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself. "It ain't much, but it's hot." A ghost of a smile touched Nantan's face. "Another time, perhaps. Today I must return to my family." He pointed to the roof. "The young man is right. Fix it before the snow comes." With that, he turned and melted back into the tree line as silently as he'd appeared. Dale and Maggie stood in silence, for a moment watching where he'd gone. Finally, Dale spoke. "Reckon we'd best get to that cedar." The day passed in steady work. Dale split shakes from the cedar log while Maggie sorted them, setting aside the best pieces. By afternoon, Dale was up on the roof carefully replacing the worst sections of shingles. Maggie handed materials up to him, her movements slow but determined. As the sun began to sink, the air grew sharper with coming cold. Dale secured the last shake and climbed down, his clothes dusted with cedar shavings and his hands raw from the work. "That'll hold now," he said with satisfaction, looking up at the repaired roof. Not a moment too soon, either. Skies fixing to snow again tonight. Maggie nodded, studying the neat rows of new shingles. You did good work, she said quietly. Reckon I ought to feed you proper after all that. Inside the cabin, she moved with purpose, taking down her biggest pot and removing a wrapped package from her small larder. Dale washed up at the basin, watching curiously as she began preparing supper with unusual care. Nantan brought this venison 2 days ago, she explained, not meeting Dale's eyes. Been saving it, though I don't rightly know why. Her hands moved surely, cutting the meat into chunks. Been a long while since I cooked for anyone but myself. Dale sat at the table, careful to keep his tone neutral. Looks to be enough for 2. Hasn't been a man at my table since Thomas left, Maggie said abruptly, her back still turned. Thought I'd never want one here again. The stew came together slowly. Venison, dried vegetables from Maggie's garden, herbs she'd gathered in summer. The familiar motions of cooking seemed to ease something in her, and her voice grew thoughtful. Town folks warned me about Indians when I first came here, she said, stirring the pot. Said they'd kill me sure living out here alone. She shook her head. But Nantan and his people have shown me more kindness than most who call themselves Christian. Left meat when times were lean, helped mend fences when my arthritis was bad. Her voice caught slightly. Never asked nothing in return, neither. Dale listened quietly, understanding the weight of what she was sharing. The stew's rich aroma filled the cabin as evening drew in, and Maggie lit the lamp against the gathering dark. Outside, the first snow flurries began to fall. When the stew was ready, Maggie filled 2 bowls with careful deliberation. She set them on the table, then stood for a moment, her hands trembling slightly. Been eating alone a long time, she said softly. Dale looked up at her, his eyes gentle. Well, tonight you don't eat alone. Maggie sat down slowly, her face working with emotion she couldn't quite control. The lamp cast warm light across the table as they bowed their heads in silent grace. Outside, the snow fell steadily, but inside the cabin, something that had been frozen for 30 years began, ever so slightly, to thaw. The days settled into a gentle rhythm at Maggie's cabin. Each morning, Dale rose before dawn, rekindling the fire and heading out to split more wood. The steady thunk of his axe became as familiar as birdsong, marking time like a heartbeat through the crisp winter days. Inside, Maggie found herself humming as she worked, something she hadn't done in years. Her needle flashed in the lamplight during the long evenings, mending worn quilts and patching clothes. The quiet companionship filled empty spaces she'd forgotten existed. Your stitches are mighty fine, Dale commented one evening, watching her work. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Maggie's weathered hands paused briefly. My mama taught me, said a woman's worth wasn't in being fancy, but in being useful. She tied off a neat knot. Of course, and that was back in Missouri before. Her voice trailed off, but Dale understood. Before Thomas left, before 30 years of solitude, before this strange new peace they'd found. Each evening after supper, Dale would reach for Maggie's old Bible, its leather cover smooth from years of handling. His voice, warm and steady, filled the cabin with ancient words of comfort. Maggie found herself leaning forward in her chair, letting the familiar verses wash over her like a balm. The Lord is my shepherd, Dale read one night. I shall not want. Maggie closed her eyes, remembering how long it had been since she'd truly listened to these words, since she'd allowed herself to hope. The peaceful routine shattered on a bright, cold morning 7 days after Dale's arrival. Maggie was gathering eggs when she heard horses approaching. Not the quiet passage of Nantan's pony, but the hard riding of men who didn't care who heard them coming. 3 riders appeared around the bend in the trail, their horses' hooves kicking up snow. They wore heavy coats and carried rifles with the casual arrogance of men used to taking what they wanted. Railroad men, by their look and manner. Dale emerged from the woodshed, his movements unhurried but alert. He positioned himself between the riders and Maggie, who clutched her egg basket like a shield. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a week's growth of beard, reined his horse to a stop. "This the Keen place?" he demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. "It is," Dale answered evenly. "Something we can help you with?" The man's eyes narrowed. "Name's Burke. Railroads got interest in this parcel. Need to see the deed." He looked past Dale to Maggie. "Fetch it, woman." Maggie's spine stiffened at his tone. "I don't fetch for any man," she said sharply. "And my deed's legal and proper, filed at the county seat 28 years ago." Burke spat into the snow. "Lots changed in 28 years. Railroads got government backing now. Best thing for everyone is if you sell quiet-like and move on." "She's not selling," Dale said quietly. His hands were empty, but his stance made it clear he wasn't backing down. "And you're trespassing on private property?" The second rider, a thin man with cold eyes, laughed harshly. "Private property? Out here? Railroads bringing civilization progress. Ain't no place for stubborn old women holding on to worthless land." "I suggest you leave," Dale said, his voice carrying the kind of calm that comes before a storm. "Now." Burke's hand moved toward his rifle. "Or what, boy? You planning to take on all three of us?" "He is not alone." The new voice came from behind the riders. They turned to find Nantan standing there, his bow drawn, arrow pointed steadily at Burke's chest. None of them had heard him approach. "Well, if it ain't one of the local savages," the third rider sneered, but his voice wavered slightly. Nantan's aim didn't waver. "You are not welcome here. The widow has friends who know these hills well." His dark eyes were unblinking. "Very well." Burke's face flushed with anger, but he wasn't fool enough to ignore the arrow aimed at his heart. "This ain't over," he growled. "Railroad gets what it wants one way or another. We'll be back with papers and men enough to handle any interference." "Then ride," Nantan said simply. The three men wheeled their horses around, kicking them hard as they retreated. Their threats echoed behind them. "You'll regret this. All of you." When the sound of hooves faded, Maggie's legs gave way. She sank onto the cabin's front step, the egg basket falling forgotten into the snow. Dale moved quickly to her side, steadying her with a gentle hand. "You're shaking like a leaf," he said softly. "Ain't used to such trouble anymore," Maggie whispered. "Been so long since anyone cared enough to cause any." Nantan approached silently, his bow now lowered. He studied Maggie with concern. "You should come inside. The cold is not good for old bones." Maggie looked up at him, really seeing him perhaps for the first time. This man the town called Savage had just stood ready to defend her home. Would you take coffee now?" she asked hesitantly. "Got some fresh bread too, if you've a mind." A slight smile touched Nantan's lips. "Today I accept." He followed them into the cabin, ducking his head slightly under the doorframe. Inside, Maggie's hands steadied as she moved through the familiar motions of making coffee. Dale built up the fire while Nantan sat with quiet dignity at the rough table, the cabin filled with the rich aroma of coffee and the warmth of unexpected fellowship. "How did you know to come?" Maggie asked, setting cups before her guests. "I watch the trails," Nantan replied. "Such men move without care, leave clear signs. When I saw them turn toward your cabin," he shrugged slightly. "It seemed wise to follow." Maggie cut thick slices of bread, spreading them with precious butter she'd been saving. "Been a long time since anyone watched out for me," she said softly. "Accepting you these past years. Leaving meat, mending fences when I couldn't." She placed the bread before him. "Never properly thanked you for that." Nantan accepted the bread with a graceful nod. "My people believe in honoring the elderly. You have lived on this land with respect, harming none." Such neighbors are worth protecting. They sat in companionable silence for a while, sharing bread and coffee. Finally, Dale spoke the truth they all knew. They'll be back. With more men, like they said. Maggie's hands tightened around her cup. Reckon they will? The railroad has many men, Nanton agreed. But they do not know these hills as we do. They do not understand the strength of those who defend their home. He looked at Maggie intently. You are not alone in this fight, widow. Maggie felt tears prick her eyes at his words. For so long, she'd been alone. Proud of her independence, yes, but alone all the same. Now, here sat two men. One young, one native. Neither fitting any notion she'd once had of family, offering her their strength and support. I'm afraid, she admitted quietly. Been holding this place so long, living with my memories. Now, it feels like everything's changing. And I don't know if I'm strong enough for what's coming. Dale's hand covered hers gently. You're stronger than you know, Ms. Maggie. And like Nantan says, you're not alone anymore. Strange, Maggie thought, how fear and comfort could exist together in the same moment. How the threat of losing her home had somehow brought her a kind of family she'd never expected. She looked at these two men, Dale, with his quiet strength, Nantan with his dignified wisdom, and felt something she hadn't experienced in 30 years. Belonging. The winter sun slanted through the cabin windows, catching dust motes in its pale light. Outside, the world was changing. Danger approaching like storm clouds on the horizon. But here, in this moment, Maggie felt the warm weight of friendship around her like a quilt, protecting her from the cold. Well, she said finally, straightening her shoulders, reckon we best finish this coffee and start planning what comes next. The morning dawned crisp and cold, with fresh snow blanketing the ground like a pristine white quilt. Maggie stood at her cabin window watching Dale check the cinch on her old mule's saddle, her hands smoothed unconsciously over her best dress, faded but clean, with only one careful patch at the hem. Been years since I rode into town proper, she murmured more to herself than to Dale. The deed papers crinkled in her pocket where she'd tucked them carefully away. Reckon it's time, though. Dale glanced up, catching her eye through the window. He'd borrowed a horse from Nantan the evening before, a sturdy paint that stood patient in the early morning light. Everything's ready when you are, Ms. Maggie. Maggie took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped out into the biting cold. Her boots crunched in the fresh snow as she made her way to where Dale waited. He offered his hand to help her mount, but she waved him off with a stubborn shake of her head. I may be old, but I can still climb aboard Sally here without help, she declared, though her joints protested as she settled herself on the mule's broad back. Sally shifted, familiar with her rider's weight, and nickered softly. Dale swung easily into his own saddle, gathering the reins. Preacher Mackenzie should be at the church this morning. Town's about 2 hours' ride if we take it steady through the snow. They set out single file along the narrow trail, Dale leading the way. The morning was silent except for the muffled thud of hooves in snow and the occasional cry of a winter bird. Maggie found herself studying Dale's straight back, the way he rode with quiet confidence. So different from her Charles, who'd always been full of restless energy and grand dreams of gold. The sun climbed higher as they rode, casting long shadows across the pristine white landscape. Maggie's thoughts wandered to the last time she'd made this journey into town nearly 3 years ago. The shopkeeper's wife had made such a fuss about her living wild out here alone, acting as though solitude was something shameful. As they approached the outskirts of town, Maggie felt her spine stiffen. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of voices and wagon wheels carried through the clear air. Dale slowed his horse, falling back to ride beside her where the trail widened. You ready? He asked quietly. Maggie lifted her chin. Been ready 30 years, I reckon. The first townspeople they passed stopped to stare openly. Maggie heard the whispers start immediately, sharp and questioning, like the winter wind through dry grass. A group of women outside the millinery drew together, heads bent in obvious gossip as they watched Dale and Maggie pass. Look at that. The widow Keene, riding in with a young man. Scandalous at her age. Always knew she wasn't right living alone up there. Dale moved his horse slightly closer to Maggie's mule, as though to shield her from the worst of the stares. His presence felt like a warm wall at her side, steady and protective. They dismounted in front of the white-painted church, tying their mounts to the hitching post. Maggie's legs felt stiff from the ride, but she refused to show it as she climbed the church steps. Dale followed a respectful pace behind. Inside, the church was quiet and cool, smelling of pine wood and lamp oil. Preacher Mackenzie looked up from his Bible at their entrance, his weathered face creasing in surprise. "Why, Widow Keene?" he said, rising from his desk. "This is unexpected. And who might your companion be?" "Dale Merrick, sir," Dale said, removing his hat. "Been helping Ms. Maggie with some repairs." Maggie withdrew the deed papers from her pocket, spreading them carefully on the preacher's desk. "Need your counsel, preacher. Railroad men been sniffing around my property, making threats. Need to know if my claim's still good and proper." The preacher adjusted his spectacles, examining the documents with careful attention. Minutes ticked by in silence while he read, occasionally nodding or frowning. Finally, he looked up. "The deed is legal and binding, Maggie. Filed correct and proper back in 1850. He hesitated, removing his spectacles to polish them with a handkerchief. "But I've heard troubling things about the railroad's methods. They've been persuasive with certain county officials. Money changing hands. Promises made." "You mean bribes?" Dale said quietly. The preacher nodded gravely. "I've seen good folk pushed off their land already further north. The railroad claims, eminent domain offers pennies on the dollar." He reached across to pat Maggie's hand. "I'll speak for you, dear lady. Your claim is just, but be careful. These aren't men who take kindly to being refused." Maggie's fingers trembled slightly as she folded the papers away. "Much obliged for your time, preacher." Outside, the winter sun had climbed high, making the snow blindingly bright. Dale touched Maggie's elbow lightly. "Need to get some supplies while we're here." "The general store's just down the street." Maggie nodded, still processing the preacher's warnings. They walked the short distance to Whitaker's general store, their boots leaving paired tracks in the fresh snow. The bell above the door jangled as they entered. The store was warm and cluttered, filled with the mixed smells of coffee, leather, and dried goods. Mrs. Whitaker stood behind the counter, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of their appearance. Several other customers browsed the shelves, all pretending not to stare. "Need some nails," Dale said, moving toward the hardware section. "And salt, if you've got any." Mrs. Whitaker's thin lips pressed together as she watched Dale select his items. Then her gaze shifted to Maggie, who was examining a bolt of calico she could never afford. Well, the shopkeeper's wife said, her voice carrying clearly through the store. "The widow, Keene, finally showing her face in town, and with such young company." Her tone made the word young sound like something dirty. Maggie's cheeks burned, but before she could respond, Dale was beside her, setting his purchases on the counter. "Ms. Maggie's been kind enough to let me earn my keep, helping with repairs," he said pleasantly, though his eyes were steel hard. "Good Christian charity, wouldn't you say, Mrs. Whitaker?" The shopkeeper's wife sniffed. Some might call it foolish taking in strange men, especially at her time of life. She began wrapping the nails in brown paper with sharp, angry movements. "Could be dangerous, trusting drifters. Never know their true intentions." Dale counted out coins carefully, his movements deliberate and calm. "Reckon trust works both ways, ma'am. Some folks prove worthy of it. Others," he paused, meeting her eyes steadily, "prove themselves small-minded and unchristian with their judgments." A shocked silence fell over the store. Mrs. Whitaker's face flushed red as she thrust their wrapped packages across the counter. Dale collected them with a polite nod, then offered his arm to Maggie. "Shall we head home, Ms. Maggie? Weather's holding fair for now." Maggie placed her hand on his arm, head held high as they walked out. She could feel the stares following them, could almost hear the gossip that would spread through town like wildfire. But somehow, with Dale's steady presence beside her, the whispers seemed to matter less. They mounted up for the ride home as the afternoon sun began its slow descent. The return journey was quiet, broken only by the rhythmic sound of hooves crushing snow. Maggie found herself stealing glances at Dale's profile, remembering how he'd defended her honor so calmly in the store. The setting sun painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold by the time they reached her cabin. Dale helped unload the supplies, then began caring for the horses, without being asked. Maggie stood in her doorway watching him work. Shame and pride warred in her heart. Shame at how the town had treated them both. Pride in how Dale had handled it all with such quiet dignity. "You didn't have to stand up for me like that," she said finally. "In the store." Dale paused in his work, looking at her thoughtfully. "Yes, ma'am. I did." Something warm unfurled in Maggie's chest at his simple words. She turned quickly to hide the sudden moisture in her eyes, busying herself with unlocking the cabin door. "Well then," she said, her voice a bit rougher than usual. "Best come in soon. Got biscuits to bake and these old hands could use some help." The snow began falling again that evening, thick white flakes that filled the darkening sky. By morning, drifts had piled against the cabin walls, and the world beyond the windows was a blank white canvas. Dale stood at the door, studying the weather with a practiced eye. "Storms settled in for a spell," he said, turning back to where Maggie was stoking the fire. "Might be here 2-3 days by the look of those clouds." Maggie straightened slowly, one hand pressed to her lower back. "Well, ain't nothing to be done about it. Got enough food stored up thanks to your hunting." She glanced at the shelves lined with preserved vegetables and dried meat. "Though we'll need to check on them chickens regular, make sure they don't freeze." Dale nodded, already pulling on his heavy coat. "I'll dig us a path to the coop, bring in more firewood while I'm at it." Maggie watched through the frosted window as Dale worked, his broad shoulders swinging the shovel in steady rhythm. Snow continued to swirl around him, but he kept at it until he'd cleared decent paths to both the woodpile and the chicken coop. When he finally came back inside, his coat was covered in snow and his cheeks were red with cold. "Here now," Maggie said, pouring hot coffee into a tin cup. "Get yourself warm before you catch your death." Dale accepted the coffee gratefully, settling into his usual spot by the fire. He pulled out his pocket knife and a small piece of pine wood he'd been working on. His hands moved with careful precision as he began to whittle, sending small curls of wood onto the floor. Maggie watched him work while she mended a torn shirt. "What are you making there?" "Little horse," Dale replied, turning the wood to show her the rough shape emerging. "My pa taught me when I was young, said idle hands lead to trouble, but whittling keeps both hands and mind occupied." "A toy horse," Maggie said softly, her fingers stilling on her needlework. "Always thought I'd have little ones to make toys for." She hadn't meant to speak the words aloud, but there they were, hanging in the quiet air between them. Dale's knife paused. "Never had children?" Maggie shook her head, looking down at her worn hands. "Thomas and me, we tried. First few years of marriage, I prayed every night for a baby. Then he got gold fever, said he'd make us rich in California." Her voice grew bitter. "Promised he'd send for me once he struck it big. That was 1850. Never heard from him again." Dale set down his whittling, his face thoughtful. "Must have been hard, losing both husband and hopes at once." "Stopped praying after that," Maggie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Figured God wasn't listening anyway." She gestured at the Bible sitting on the shelf. "Keep it more for comfort of familiar words than true faith these days." "Know something about lost faith," Dale said quietly. After that land deal went sour, felt like nothing made sense anymore. But there's something in Scripture that speaks even when you're doubting, like a steady hand in the dark. Maggie looked at him sharply, surprised by the poetry in his words. Before she could respond, a long, mournful howl cut through the snowy silence outside. Dale was on his feet instantly, reaching for his rifle. "Wolves," he said grimly, "and closer than last time." More howls joined the first, forming a chilling chorus. Maggie grabbed her old shotgun from its place above the door, checking it was loaded with trembling fingers. "They're after the chickens," she said. "Hungry enough to come this close to buildings." Dale nodded. "Stay inside." "Don't you dare tell me to stay put," Maggie interrupted, her chin lifting. "These are my chickens, my home. I may be old, but I ain't helpless." A ghost of a smile crossed Dale's face. "Yes, ma'am. Shall we?" They stepped out into the swirling snow together. The wolves' howls were closer now, and in the gathering dusk, Maggie could see dark shapes moving at the edge of the clearing. Dale raised his rifle, firing a warning shot into the air. The shapes retreated briefly, then began advancing again. "Must be desperate," Dale muttered. "Storm's driven them down from the high country." The chicken coop erupted in frightened squawking as a large wolf darted toward it. Maggie fired her shotgun, the blast echoing across the snow. The wolf yelped and jumped back, but others were closing in from different directions. "Behind you!" Maggie shouted, and Dale spun, firing at a gray shape that had tried to circle around them. His shot found its mark, and the wolf collapsed in the snow. The rest of the pack hesitated, then pressed forward again, driven by hunger. For several terrifying minutes, Maggie and Dale stood back to back, firing and reloading, shouting and waving their arms when ammunition ran low. The wolves darted in and out of the falling snow like gray ghosts, their eyes gleaming with desperate hunger. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, the pack retreated, leaving their fallen member behind in the bloodied snow. Maggie's hands were shaking as she lowered her shotgun. She suddenly realized she was freezing, her coat unbuttoned in her haste to get outside. Dale didn't look much better, snow coating his shoulders and hair. "Inside," he said firmly, keeping his rifle ready as. They backed toward the cabin door. Only when they were safely inside with the door barred did Maggie feel her legs go weak. She stumbled slightly, and Dale caught her elbow, steadying her. "Sit," he ordered gently, leading her to her chair by the fire. He quickly added more wood to the dying embers, building the flames back up until warmth began to return to the room. Maggie found herself laughing, a slightly hysterical sound. "Lord above, I haven't had excitement like that since ever." Dale chuckled too, the tension of the fight draining away. "You're quite a shot, Ms. Maggie. Remind me never to get on your bad side." "Learn to shoot out of necessity," she said, still laughing. "Living alone all these years. Though I admit, it's easier with someone watching my back." Dale settled into the chair beside her, closer than he'd ever sat before. His arm brushed against hers, and for the first time Maggie didn't pull away. The contact felt comfortable. Right somehow. They sat in companionable silence, watching the fire dance. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance a lone wolf howled, a sound more mournful than threatening now. Maggie found herself thinking about what Dale had said about Scripture being like a steady hand in the dark. "Would you read some?" she asked suddenly. "From the Bible? And so long since I heard those words spoken proper." Dale reached for the worn Bible on the shelf, handling it with gentle respect. He opened it carefully, pages crackling, and began to read in his deep, steady voice. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Maggie closed her eyes, letting the familiar words wash over her. The fire crackled. Dale's voice rose and fell with the ancient rhythm of the psalm, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something like peace settle in her heart. The winter storms howled across the Colorado highlands with fierce determination, piling snow against Maggie's cabin in deep drifts. Inside, The warmth of the recently repaired stove and the scent of smoking venison created a cozy refuge from the bitter cold. Dale stood at the smokehouse door, carefully tending to the meat Nantan had brought them 2 days ago. The Apache scout had appeared silently through the swirling snow, leading a pack mule loaded with fresh venison. He'd offered it in trade for some of Maggie's preserved vegetables and cornmeal, a fair exchange that benefited both households. "Stum's getting worse," Dale called out as Maggie approached with a cup of hot coffee. "Might last several days by the look of those clouds." "Much obliged," he said, accepting the steaming cup. His fingers brushed hers briefly as he took it, and Maggie no longer flinched at the contact as she once would have. "Nantan said this would be a hard winter," Maggie replied, pulling her shawl tighter. "Reckon he knows the signs better than most." She peered at the hanging meat. "You've done a fine job with the smoking. Where'd you learn such skills?" Dale took a careful sip of coffee before answering. "My pa taught me, starting when I was just a boy. Spent my youth in the Rockies learning everything he knew about trapping and surviving in the wild." His eyes grew distant with memory. He was strict but fair. Said a man needed to know how to provide for himself and others. Maggie nodded, understanding in her expression. "Your pa sounds like a wise man." "He was," Dale agreed quietly. "Lost him to mountain fever when I was 17. But everything he taught me stayed with me, helped me make my way in the world." They worked together through the afternoon, checking the smokehouse periodically and repairing sections of fence that had been damaged by the heavy snow. Dale showed Maggie how to brace the posts more securely, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air as they worked. As evening approached, they retreated to the warmth of the cabin. Maggie busied herself preparing a simple supper while Dale built up the fire. The familiar routine they'd developed over the past weeks felt comfortable now, almost natural. "Tell me about where you grew up," Dale said as he added another log to the flames. "You mentioned Missouri once." Maggie's hands stilled briefly as she kneaded dough for biscuits. "Been so long since I thought about those days," she said softly. "Grew up near Independence, on a small farm. Mama taught me everything about keeping house and tending gardens. Papa was always reading his Bible, teaching us children our letters." "How many siblings did you have?" Dale asked, settling into his chair by the fire. "4 brothers, all older. I was the baby of the family." A small smile touched her lips. "They spoiled me something terrible, but they also made sure I knew how to shoot straight and ride proper. Said their baby sister wasn't going to be helpless." She slid the biscuits into the oven, then wiped her hands on her apron. "Met Thomas when I was 16. He was 22, full of dreams about going west." Her voice grew softer. "Married him 6 months later. Thought we'd build a life together." Dale watched her carefully, sensing there was more she needed to say. The firelight cast flickering shadows across her face, highlighting the mix of strength and sorrow in her features. "Maggie," he said gently, "might I ask you something?" She looked at him warily, but nodded. "That first night when I came to your door, you declared that no man had touched you since 1850. I've wondered about those words, though I didn't want to pry." Maggie was silent for a long moment, her hands clutching her apron. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Thomas left in the spring of 1850. The gold fever had him bad by then. He promised to send for me once he struck it rich in California." She gave a bitter laugh. "Said it wouldn't take more than a few months. Told me to wait, to be a good wife." Dale remained quiet, letting her continue at her own pace. "First year, I got 2 letters. Then nothing. Years passed. Some folks in town said I should declare him dead, find another husband. But I'd made vows before God and my family." Her chin lifted proudly. "I may have been abandoned, but I wouldn't break those vows, keeping my word, keeping my dignity. Sometimes it was all I had. Keeping faith when the world gives you every reason to break it, that takes rare courage." Dale said softly. Maggie's eyes filled with tears, though none fell. Some called me a fool. Said I was wasting my life waiting for a man who'd clearly forgotten me. But it wasn't about waiting for Thomas anymore. It was about being true to myself, to who I was raised to be. You have more courage than any man I've known, Dale said, his voice thick with respect. Standing alone all these years, holding to your principles when it would have been easier to give in. A tear finally slipped down Maggie's cheek. Thank you, she whispered. For understanding. For not pitying me. The timer Maggie used for baking chimed softly, breaking the emotional moment. She wiped her eyes quickly and went to check the biscuits. These are done, she announced, her voice steadier now. Then, after a slight hesitation, she added, Would you like to sit at the table proper tonight? Share supper with me? Dale understood the significance of the invitation. Until now, he'd eaten his meals in his chair by the fire, still somewhat separate despite their growing friendship. This was Maggie offering him a place at her table, accepting him as more than just a temporary guest. I'd be honored, he said simply. Maggie lit the candle at the center of the small table, its warm glow creating a circle of light that seemed to hold them both. She served the biscuits and some of the venison stew she'd made earlier, then sat down across from Dale. For a moment, she looked uncertain, as if surprised by her own boldness in having a man at her table after so many years alone. Then Dale bowed his head slightly, waiting for her to say grace as she always did, and her face softened. Lord, she began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. We thank you for this food, for shelter from the storm, and for sending company when it was most needed. Amen, Dale said quietly. They ate together in comfortable silence, broken only by the howling wind outside and the occasional pop from the fire. The candle flame danced between them, casting warm light on their faces and the simple meal they shared. Later, as Dale added more wood to the fire for the night, Maggie sat in her rocking chair, picking up her mending. The familiar routine felt different now, somehow more settled, as if some invisible barrier had finally fallen away between them. My brothers would be pleased, she said suddenly, her needle flashing in the firelight. Dale looked up questioningly. Knowing I'm not alone anymore, she explained. Knowing there's someone here who... She paused, searching for the right words. Someone who understands about keeping faith, even when it's hard. Dale nodded, understanding all she wasn't saying. They'd both lost faith in different ways, she through abandonment, he through betrayal. But somehow, in this small cabin with winter raging outside, they'd found something that felt like trust again. The wind continued to howl, piling snow against the windows, but inside the cabin, Maggie and Dale sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but no longer quite so alone. The morning dawned bright and bitter cold. Frost painted delicate patterns across the cabin's windows, and the snow-covered ground sparkled like scattered diamonds in the early light. Maggie stood at her stove, stirring a pot of porridge while Dale checked the smokehouse one final time before breakfast. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the peaceful morning. Maggie's wooden spoon clattered against the pot as she hurried to the window. Through the frost-etched glass, she saw several riders approaching, led by Deputy Horace Greeley. Her heart sank at the sight of his polished badge and the self-important tilt of his chin. "Dale," she called out, her voice sharp with worry. "The deputy's coming." Dale emerged from the smokehouse, carefully closing the door behind him. He walked toward the cabin with measured steps, his face set in careful neutrality as the riders drew near. Deputy Greeley reined his horse to a stop, snow flying from its hooves. His mount tossed its head, brass bits jingling in the cold air. 4 other men flanked him, their expressions hard beneath their hat brims. "Mrs. Keene," the deputy called out, not bothering to dismount. "Got some official business with you this morning." Maggie stepped out onto her porch, drawing her shawl tight around her shoulders. Dale moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "What kind of business deputy?" Maggie asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Greeley pulled a folded paper from his coat with flourish. "Got here a legal writ, declaring this property forfeit to the railroad company." His thin lips curved in a smile that held no warmth. "Seems your claim don't hold up against progress, ma'am." "That's not possible," Dale said. "Her deed is legal and proper." "Ain't asking your opinion, drifter," Greeley snapped. He turned back to Maggie. "Way I hear it, you've been living here alone, holding on to land that could serve a greater purpose. Railroads offering fair compensation." Maggie's spine stiffened. "This is my home. I won't be bought out or forced out. Now. Greeley's voice dripped with false sympathy. "Let's not make this difficult. A woman your age, living alone, might be time to accept the Lord's leading toward a more suitable situation." "Don't you dare bring the Lord into your thievery," Maggie said, her voice trembling with anger. She disappeared into the cabin for a moment, returning with her family Bible. "This book teaches truth and justice. What you're doing is neither." The deputy's face darkened. He swung down from his horse, boots crunching in the snow as he stalked toward the porch. "That old book won't help you now, woman. Times are changing. Progress don't wait for sentiment and scripture." Before Maggie could react, Greeley snatched the Bible from her hands. With a contemptuous laugh, he tossed it into a snowbank. "No!" Maggie cried out, starting forward. Dale moved like lightning. His fist connected with Greeley's jaw, sending the deputy sprawling backward into the snow. "You heartless snake," Dale growled, standing over him. The deputy's men leaped from their horses, drawing weapons. Two grabbed Dale's arms while another pressed a revolver to his ribs. Dale struggled briefly but went still when the gun barrel dug deeper. Greeley rose slowly, wiping blood from his split lip. His eyes blazed with fury and humiliation. "Assaulting an officer of the law," he spat. "That'll earn you some steel bracelets, boy." He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "He was protecting my property," Maggie protested. "You had no right to destroy my Bible." "A woman's word against mine?" Greeley laughed coldly as he clamped the cuffs around Dale's wrists. "Won't carry much weight in court, especially not from a dried-up old maid who's lost her senses." "You're the one who'll answer for this," Dale said, his voice low and dangerous despite his bonds. "Get him on a horse," Greeley ordered his men. "We'll let the judge sort this out." He turned back to Maggie with a sneer. "Meanwhile, I suggest you start packing. Railroad's coming through, whether you like it or not." Maggie could only watch helplessly as they forced Dale onto one of their horses, binding his legs beneath the animal's belly with rope. Her throat closed around desperate words as they turned to ride away. "Dale!" she finally managed to call out. He twisted in the saddle to look back at her, his face tight with concern. "Stay strong, Maggie. Don't let them—" A rough hand yanked his shoulder, cutting off his words. The riders disappeared down the trail, hoofbeats fading into the winter morning. Maggie stood frozen on her porch for several long moments, her breath coming in small, painful gasps. Finally, she stumbled down the steps toward the snowbank where her Bible lay. Kneeling in the snow, she lifted the precious book with trembling hands. Water had already seeped into its pages, making the thin paper stick together. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched it to her chest. "Lord," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Lord, please. I know I haven't talked to you proper in years, but please." The words dissolved into quiet sobs as she knelt there, alone in the vast white silence. The sun climbed higher in the cold sky as Maggie remained in the snow, holding her damaged Bible and wrestling with fears she thought she'd conquered long ago. The familiar weight of solitude pressed down on her shoulders, heavier now for having known companionship again. Eventually, the biting cold forced her to move. Her skirts were soaked through as she rose stiffly, her joints protesting the long kneeling in the snow. She walked slowly back to her cabin, each step feeling like it carried the weight of all her years alone. Inside, the fire had burned low, and the forgotten porridge had scorched in its pot. The cabin seemed eerily quiet without Dale's steady presence. His empty chair by the hearth struck her heart like a physical blow. Maggie placed her wet Bible carefully on the table, then sank into her rocking chair. The familiar creak of its runners offered no comfort now. She stared at the dying fire, remembering how Dale had kept it stoked, how he'd read from that very Bible in his warm, steady voice. Fear crept in like the winter cold. Fear for Dale, fear for her home, fear of being truly alone again. The deputy's cruel words echoed in her mind, making her doubt everything she'd built here. Was she just a foolish old woman clinging to the past? But, beneath the fear, something else stirred. The memory of Dale standing up for her dignity, defending her home as if it were his own, sparked a fierce determination. She'd survived 30 years alone on this land. She'd kept her vows, kept her pride, kept her faith even when it dwindled to the smallest ember. The railroad and their corrupt deputy might have taken Dale, but they hadn't broken her yet. Maggie stood slowly and walked to the table where her Bible lay. With gentle hands, she began carefully separating the wet pages, laying them open to dry. Outside, the winter wind howled around her cabin's corners. And somewhere in town, Dale sat in a cell because he'd defended her honor. Maggie's hands trembled as she worked, but her jaw was set with determination. She had no idea how to fight this battle, but she knew she couldn't give up. The morning's bright promise had turned to bitter ashes, leaving her alone with her fears and her prayers. But as she tenderly cared for each damaged page of her Bible, Maggie whispered broken prayers, for Dale's safety, for guidance, for the strength to face whatever came next. The cabin's silence pressed in around her, heavier than any snow. The empty cabin echoed with Maggie's footsteps as she moved listlessly through her evening routine. The wood she added to the fire seemed heavier without Dale's strong hands to help. Steam rose from the soup pot, but she couldn't bring herself to eat. The aroma that usually brought comfort only reminded her of shared meals now lost. Settling into her rocker, memories of 28 years alone crashed over her like waves. Every creak of the cabin boards, every whistle of wind through the chinks brought back the endless nights since 1850, when John had walked away with dreams of California gold in his eyes. She'd survived then, built a life of dignity and independence. But now, with Dale gone, the solitude felt sharper, more cutting. Her gaze fell on the Bible, its pages still damp and wrinkled from the snow. With trembling fingers, she opened it to where Dale's bookmark lay, a piece of kindling he'd whittled smooth. The words swam before her tired eyes, but she forced herself to read aloud, just as Dale had done. "Fear not, for I'm with thee." Her voice cracked on the familiar verse. Dale had chosen it just nights ago, his deep voice bringing warmth to the ancient words. Now they seemed to speak directly to her heart, cutting through layers of hurt and fear. Maggie slid from her chair to her knees, hands clasped tight. "Lord," she whispered, "I've been proud and stubborn, thinking I could face everything alone. But I need your help now. Please protect Dale. Give me strength to stand. Show me the way forward." The prayer continued, words flowing easier with each moment, like a rusty pump finally drawing water. Tears fell freely as she poured out her heart, no longer ashamed to admit her need. A soft knock at the door startled her from prayer. Nantan stood in the doorway, his dark eyes grave in the lamplight. He stepped inside, removing his hat with respect. "Railroad men make plans," he said quietly. "Tomorrow, they come with fire, mean to burn you out." Maggie's hand flew to her throat. "Burn my home?" Nantan nodded solemnly. "My people watch their camp, hear their talk." He met her eyes steadily. "If you find courage to stay, we stand with you. Your claim is just. Your heart is strong. Maggie rose slowly, crossing to the tin box where she kept her deed. The paper felt fragile in her hands, but the ink still showed clear and true. Her name, her claim, her right to this land, all legal and proper. Looking up at Nantan, she felt the spark of determination growing stronger. I won't run, she said firmly. This is my home. God helping me, I'll defend it. A hint of approval showed in Nantan's slight nod. Then you not stand alone. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Inside her cabin, Maggie moved with quiet purpose, each step measured and deliberate. Her hands trembled slightly as she retrieved the tin box from its shelf, but her jaw was set with determination. The deed lay smooth on the rough-hewn table, its aged paper a testament to decades of belonging. Maggie traced her name with one weathered finger, remembering the day John had proudly presented it to her. Our piece of heaven, he'd called it, before gold fever took him away. She lifted her old brass lantern from its hook, checking the oil level carefully. The glass was clean, polished just yesterday by Dale's careful hands. The memory of his steady presence brought both pain and strength. Maggie carried the lantern to the window facing the town road, setting it purposefully on the sill. Its flame burned bright against the pale morning sky. Not a beacon of welcome, but a declaration of defiance. Let them come, she whispered, straightening her apron. This is my home. Miles away in the town jail, Dale sat with his back against cold iron bars. His jaw ached where the deputy's fist had landed, but the pain was nothing compared to his worry for Maggie. He'd failed her, left her alone to face whatever the railroad men planned. Bootsteps echoed on the wooden floor outside his cell. Dale looked up to see Preacher Matthews standing there, his kind face stern with righteous anger. The deputy lounged at his desk, feet propped up, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. This ain't right, Horace, the preacher said, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. You're holding an innocent man while thieves prepare to steal a widow's home. Deputy Greeley barely glanced up. He assaulted an officer of the law. Ain't nothing innocent about that. The Lord sees all, Matthews responded, including deputies who take railroad money to abuse their position. That got Greeley's attention. He stood up, face flushing. You best watch your tongue, preacher. Even a man of God can find himself in trouble. Indeed. Matthews pulled out a letter. Perhaps the circuit judge would be interested in these accounts I've been keeping. Seems a lot of settlers have lost their land under suspicious circumstances lately. The deputy's face darkened further. The slander, old man. Truth is an absolute defense against slander charges, Matthews replied calmly. I believe I'll go telegraph the judge right now. Unless... Greeley stalked closer, jabbing a finger at the preacher's chest. Unless what? Unless we discuss this matter in private. Perhaps over at the church? Matthews glanced meaningfully at Dale, then back to the deputy. I have some evidence you might want to see. Dale watched the exchange carefully, noting how the preacher positioned himself between the deputy and the cell door. His heart began to pound as he understood the opportunity being created. After a tense moment, Greeley snatched his coat. Fine. Let's see this evidence of yours. He followed Matthews toward the door, pausing to glare at Dale. Don't go nowhere, Drifter. The moment their footsteps faded, Dale moved. The cell door was unlocked. He'd heard the click when the preacher had leaned against it earlier. Slipping out silently, he found his gun belt hanging on a peg. Outside, the night air bit cold and sharp. A saddled horse waited in the alley behind the jail, reins loosely tied. Dale recognized the preacher's distinctive tooled saddle. Mounting quickly, he turned the horse toward Maggie's cabin and urged it into a gallop. Snow flew from the horse's hooves as Dale pushed hard through the darkness. His ribs ached with each stride, but he ignored the pain. Above, stars wheeled in the clear night sky as he rode, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Lord, he prayed aloud, voice rough with cold and worry. "I ain't been much for praying. But Maggie needs help now. Give me strength to reach her in time. Let me make this right." The horse's breathing grew labored as they climbed the snowy trail. Dale leaned forward, encouraging it on. In his mind, he saw Maggie alone in her cabin, proud and vulnerable. The thought spurred him to push harder through the darkness. Meanwhile, Maggie sat in her rocker by the fire, waiting. Her Bible lay open in her lap, but her eyes were fixed on the window where the lantern burned steady and bright. The deed remained on the table, a silent witness to her right to this land. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of dawn and whatever challenges it would bring. Her hands were steady now as she gripped the arms of her rocker. The fear wasn't gone, but it had transformed into something stronger, determination born of faith renewed and dignity defended. Whatever came with the morning light, she would face it standing firm. The mid-morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered yard as Maggie stood at her window. Her fingers worked the worn cotton of her apron as she watched, the trail leading to town. The lantern still burned in the window, though its flame seemed pale against the bright winter day. A drumming of hooves broke the silence. Her heart clenched as she counted 6 riders approaching, torches held high despite the daylight, a clear message of their intentions. Deputy Greeley led them, his badge catching the sun like a mocking wink. Maggie's hands steadied as she picked up the deed from the table. The paper felt warm, alive somehow, as though it held not just her claim to the land, but all the years she'd poured into making it home. She stepped onto her porch, chin lifted, and waited. The riders pulled up in a loose half-circle before her cabin. Their horses stamped restlessly in the snow, breath steaming in the cold air. One of the railroad men lit his torch with slow deliberation, flames crackling in the stillness. "Time's up, widow," Deputy Greeley called out, his voice carrying a nasty edge. "Either walk away now, or we'll make sure there's nothing left to stay for." Maggie unfolded her deed with careful movements. "This paper says different, Deputy, signed and witnessed proper in 1849. This land is mine by law and by right." "Laws changed," another man sneered, spurring his horse forward. "Railroads got paper too, fresh from the territorial office." "My claim stands first," Maggie declared, her voice stronger than she felt. "I won't be moved." The deputy's face darkened. He nodded to his men, who dismounted with ugly purpose, torches raised. They took 3 steps toward the porch before a sharp whistle cut through the air. From the tree line, figures emerged like shadows taking form. Nantan stood tall among his kinsmen, their rifles and bows held with quiet readiness. They moved with fluid grace through the snow, spreading out in a wide arc behind Maggie's cabin. The railroad men faltered, torches wavering. Deputy Greeley's hand strayed to his gun, but Nantan's calm voice stopped him. "This woman speaks truth," Nantan said, each word measured and clear. "My people have watched her tend this land longer than you have worn that star, Deputy. Her claim is honored." Movement on the trail drew everyone's attention. More horses approached, townspeople drawn by gossip and concern. The preacher was among them, along with storekeepers and farmers. They gathered at a cautious distance, watching the scene unfold with growing unease. Just then, hoofbeats thundered from the opposite direction. Dale Merrick rode hard through the morning light, his face bruised but his bearing proud. He reined in sharply beside the porch, dismounting in one fluid motion despite his injuries. Without hesitation, he climbed the steps to stand beside Maggie. His hand came to rest lightly on her shoulder, not possessive, but supporting. The touch sent warmth through Maggie's cold, numbed body. She straightened further, feeling strength flow between them. "You're interfering with the law, Merrick," Deputy Greeley growled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "No, sir," Dale replied evenly. "I'm standing with the law, the true law that protects honest claims and honest people. This land belongs to Maggie Keene, and we aim to see justice done." The gathered townspeople murmured, many nodding in agreement. The preacher's voice rose clear. "Amen to that." Nantan moved closer, his presence both graceful and formidable. Two of his men flanked the porch while others maintained their positions among the trees, weapons steady. The deputy looked around, measuring the situation. His men shifted uneasily, torches drooping as their confidence waned. The watching crowd had grown larger, their disapproval becoming more vocal. "This ain't over," Greeley spat, but his bluster rang hollow. He jerked his reins around, spurring his horse perhaps harder than necessary. His men scrambled back into their saddles, letting their torches fall harmlessly into the snow. As they rode away, their threats hung in the frosty air like smoke, present but dispersing in the clean mountain wind. The watching townspeople began to drift closer, offering quiet words of support. The preacher stepped forward to clasp Maggie's hand, his weathered face beaming with approval. Through it all, Dale's hand remained on Maggie's shoulder, steady and warm. She found herself leaning slightly into that support, accepting it not as weakness, but as the strength of connection. Nantan approached the porch, inclining his head with grave respect. "You honor your land," he said simply. "We will remember." Maggie looked out over the snow-covered hills that had been her home for so long. The morning sun caught the frost on bare branches, making them shimmer like diamonds. She felt Dale's presence beside her, saw Nantan's quiet dignity, and knew that something had shifted, not just for her land, but in her heart. The afternoon sun hung low over the town, as Maggie's mule picked its way down the muddy main street, Dale riding close beside her. Fresh snow had begun to fall, dusting their shoulders as they made their way toward the whitewashed church that stood like a sentinel at the end of the street. "You sure about this?" Dale asked softly, his breath visible in the cold air. Maggie gripped her deed tighter, the paper crackling beneath her worn gloves. "Some things need saying in the light of day," she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Word of the morning's confrontation had spread quickly. Townspeople emerged from shops and homes, gathering in clusters along the street. Some nodded in greeting, while others whispered behind raised hands. Maggie sat straighter in her saddle, feeling their eyes upon her. The preacher stood waiting on the church steps, his Bible held firmly against his chest. Behind him, more townsfolk gathered, drawn by the promise of drama. Even the storekeepers had abandoned their posts to witness what would unfold. Nantan and three of his kinsmen appeared silently at the edge of the crowd, their presence lending gravity to the moment. They stood apart, but watchful, a reminder of the morning's show of strength. Maggie dismounted carefully, accepting Dale's steadying hand. Her boots crunched in the fresh snow as she climbed the church. Steps. Below her, the crowd grew larger. Farmers, merchants, women with children, all pressed closer to hear. Deputy Greeley slouched against his horse at the edge of the gathering, trying to affect indifference. But his fingers drummed nervously against his gun belt as he watched Maggie take her position. "Good people," the preacher called out, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "We gather to hear truth spoken and justice sought. Mrs. Keene would share her claim before God and community." Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded her deed. Dale moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could draw strength from his presence without touching. She cleared her throat and began to read. "This deed, witnessed and signed in the year of our Lord 1849, grants to Thomas and Margaret Keene the homestead claim of 160 acres. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, detailing the boundaries and rights of her land. "The witnesses here signed," she proclaimed, holding the paper higher, "include James Morton, who many of you knew as our first schoolmaster, and Chief Walking Bear, who traded fair with settlers when this was still wild country." A murmur ran through the crowd at the mention of these respected names from the town's early days. The preacher stepped forward, adding his authority to her words. "I have examined this deed myself," he declared. "It is proper and true, recorded in county books before most of us arrived in these hills. No railroad claim can justly supersede it." Deputy Greeley pushed away from his horse, face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "That paper's near 30 years old. Times change, woman. Progress don't wait on—" "The law waits on justice," Dale cut in. his quiet voice carrying surprising weight. "And justice remembers who came first, who worked the land honest, who kept faith with neighbors." He glanced meaningfully at Nantan, who inclined his head in acknowledgement. More townspeople voiced their agreement. The blacksmith's wife stepped forward, speaking up clearly. "I remember when Ms. Keene nursed my Thomas through fever, asked nothing in return." That land's hers true as scripture. Others joined in, sharing stories of Maggie's quiet generosity over the years. Vegetables shared in lean times, comfort offered in grief, a warm hearth for travelers. Each testimony built upon the last, weaving a tapestry of community that no paper from the territorial office could match. The railroad men who had lingered at the edge of the crowd began to drift away, seeing the tide of public opinion turn decisively against them. Deputy Greeley made one last attempt to salvage his authority. "This ain't proper legal proceeding," he blustered, but his words fell flat in the face of the community's united voice. "Perhaps not," the preacher agreed mildly. "But it is proper justice, witnessed by God and good people. The railroad will need to find another path." A spontaneous cheer went up from the crowd. Maggie's legs went weak with relief, but Dale's hand was there, steady at her elbow. "Your courage has already won the day," he whispered, his words meant for her alone. The gathering slowly dispersed, but not before many stepped forward to shake Maggie's hand or offer quiet words of support. Even those who had previously shunned her now showed respect, touched by her dignified stand. As the sun dipped toward the mountains, a group of townspeople fell in beside Maggie and Dale for the ride back to her cabin. They formed an honor guard of sorts. The preacher, the blacksmith and his wife, several farmers and Nantan's people keeping pace from the shadows of the trees. Maggie rode tall in her saddle, despite her exhaustion. The deed was safely tucked away, but its victory lived in her heart and in the faces of those who now surrounded her with protection and acceptance. The snow continued to fall softly, blessing the land she had defended with a clean white blanket. Evening settled over the Colorado highlands, painting the snow-covered ground in shades of purple and gold. Smoke curled from Maggie's chimney into the darkening sky as a procession of wagons and riders made their way up the narrow trail to her cabin. Dale stood on the porch watching the approaching townspeople with cautious optimism. Behind him, Maggie peered through the window, her hands nervously smoothing her apron. "Looks like half the town's coming," Dale said softly. The first wagon pulled up, driven by the blacksmith's wife. In the back, stacked neatly, were splits of firewood and burlap sacks of flour. More wagons followed, bearing quilts wrapped in oilcloth, preserves in glass jars, and other offerings. "Mrs. Keene," the blacksmith's wife called out, climbing down from her seat. "We've brought some things, well, to make amends, you might say." Maggie stepped onto the porch, her eyes wide at the gathering crowd. Women she'd seen whisper behind their hands at the general store now approached with genuine smiles. Men who'd avoided her gaze on Sunday mornings touched their hats respectfully. I don't rightly know what to say," Maggie managed, her voice thick with emotion. Dale stepped forward, practical as always. "Let me help carry those inside, ma'am," he said to the blacksmith's wife, already moving to unload the firewood. More townspeople came forward, each bearing gifts. Mrs. Peterson brought a patchwork quilt she'd finished that summer. The cooper's wife offered a barrel of salted pork. Even old Mr. Jenkins, who rarely left his store, had sent fresh coffee beans and sugar. "We've been poor neighbors, Ms. Keene," Mrs. Peterson admitted, her eyes downcast. "All these years, letting gossip stand between us." Maggie's initial shock gave way to gracious hospitality. "Well, now, you're here today," she said warmly, "and I've got apple cider warming on the stove. Won't you all come in?" Dale organized the men in storing firewood and supplies while Maggie directed traffic inside her cabin. The small space filled quickly with people, their boots stamping snow at the threshold, their voices rising in cheerful conversation. Children darted between adults' legs, discovering the wooden toys Dale had carved during. The long winter evenings. A little girl clutched a small horse, running it along the windowsill with quiet pleasure. Two boys competed with matching wooden soldiers, their playful battle cries mixing with adult laughter. "Did you make these, Mr. Merrick?" the Cooper's youngest asked, holding up a carefully whittled deer. Dale nodded, a slight smile warming his weathered face. Had to do something besides eat all Mrs. Keene's cornbread. This brought appreciative chuckles from the adults. Maggie, passing by with a tray of steaming cups, felt her chest tighten at the sound. How long had it been since her cabin held such joy? The preacher's wife helped distribute the cider, commenting on how well kept everything was. "And that stove draws better than mine," she added, nodding at Dale's handiwork. "Mr. Merrick fixed it," Maggie said proudly. "He's got away with broken things." The lamplight seemed to glow brighter, reflecting off the fresh scrubbed floors and well-tended furniture. What had once felt like a lonely outpost now hummed with life and warmth. Every corner held a conversation, every window framed friendly faces. Dale found himself by the fireplace, watching Maggie move among her guests. She'd tied a clean apron over her best dress, and her gray hair was neatly pinned back. But it was her expression that transformed her. The years of isolation seemed to fall away as she laughed with the other women, accepted compliments on her cider, directed children to more toys. The cabin itself seemed to expand with hospitality. What had been a shelter against loneliness became a beacon of fellowship. Through the windows, Dale could see more wagons arriving, more neighbors drawn to the warmth and light. Maggie caught his eye across the room, and in that moment they shared an understanding. This gathering was more than just an apology. It was a rebirth. The woman who had declared, "No man's touched me since 1850, had found something perhaps more precious than romance. She had become the heart of a community that finally recognized her worth. As evening deepened, the laughter of playing children echoed off the cabin walls. The smell of cider and wood smoke mingled with the aroma of fresh-baked bread someone had brought. Maggie's cabin glowed like a lantern in the gathering dark, no longer a symbol of solitude, but a testament to the power of reconciliation and acceptance. Dale watched it all with quiet pride, knowing that Maggie's courage had not only saved her land, but had healed something broken in the fabric of the town itself. Her steadfast dignity had shown them all a better way forward, together. The lamplight that had once seemed so lonely now spilled from her windows like a welcome, drawing people in from the cold to share in the warmth of true community. As twilight deepened into night, the last wagon departed down the snowy trail, leaving behind a warm silence filled with lingering echoes of laughter and friendship. Maggie stood in her doorway waving until the lantern lights disappeared around the bend. When she turned back inside, Dale was already stoking, the fire adding fresh logs to chase away the evening chill. The cabin felt different now, lived in, blessed with memories of community rather than loneliness. Plates and cups from their gathering sat stacked neatly on the table, waiting to be washed. Children's footprints still marked the swept floor, and the scent of cider hung sweet in the air. "Reckon we ought to have supper," Maggie said, moving to her pantry. "All that serving and hardly a bite eaten." Dale nodded, hanging his coat on its peg. "Let me help with those dishes first." Together they worked in comfortable quiet, Dale washing while Maggie dried, their movements in easy harmony. When the kitchen was set to rights, Maggie began preparing a simple meal, cornbread and beans with some of Mrs. Peterson's fresh-churned butter as a treat. The familiar routine of setting the table felt different tonight. Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she placed 2 plates instead of her usual one. When she set the second plate before Dale, it rang with a permanence that made her pause. "Thank you," she said softly, not meeting his eyes, "for choosing to stay. Could have wandered on after the trouble passed, but you didn't." Dale looked up from where he sat, his face gentle in the lamplight. "Truth is, Maggie, I've found more peace here than in all my years of roaming. Never thought to find a home again, not after—" He trailed off, then added, "This cabin's got something special. Reckon you do too." Maggie's eyes glistened as she tucked a strand of gray hair behind her ear. Before she could respond, a soft knock sounded at the door. Dale rose to answer it, revealing Nantan's tall figure silhouetted against the starlit snow. "Come for evening words," Nantan said, remaining respectfully at the threshold. "To wish good rest." Maggie approached the door, wiping her hands on her apron. "Won't you take some supper?" Nantan shook his head, smiling slightly. "Have eaten with family. Came to say, bonds are stronger now, between your people and mine." He gestured toward the town. "Good things grow from truth spoken brave." "You helped make that happen," Dale said, "standing with us." "The land knows its true friends," Nantan replied. His eyes met Maggie's. "You have earned peace here, woman who stands firm, and good company to share it." With a slight nod that encompassed them both, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, silent as a shadow. Maggie closed the door slowly, touched by his words. The cabin felt warmer somehow, more secure. She and Dale returned to their supper, sharing the meal in comfortable silence broken only by the crack of burning logs and the clink of spoons against bowls. After the dishes were cleared, they settled into their familiar evening positions by the fire. Dale sat in the chair he'd mended weeks ago, while Maggie took her rocker, her darning forgotten in her lap. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and outside, a lone coyote called to the rising moon. Maggie studied her hands, worn and weathered by years of solitary work. Slowly, deliberately, she reached across the space between them and placed her right hand atop Dale's where it rested on the chair arm. The touch was gentle, uncertain, but unafraid. Dale's breath caught slightly. With infinite care, he turned his hand beneath hers, clasping it tenderly. His smile held both honor and gratitude, understanding the gift of trust she offered. They sat like that, hands joined, watching the fires dance. The woman who had once declared, "No man's touched me since 1850, had found her way back to human connection, not through desperate longing or weakness, but through strength, dignity, and the patient building of trust. The firelight played across their joined hands, his strong and calloused, hers marked by time, but still capable. Together they had defended this cabin against more than just railroad men. They had stood against loneliness, against bitterness, against the slow erosion of hope. Now, in the quiet of their shared evening, that victory felt complete. The cabin held them in its warmth, no longer a shelter against the world, but a home where two wounded souls had found healing in mutual respect and understanding. Their hands remained clasped, a bridge built of countless small kindnesses, morning chores and evening prayers, of shared meals and shared dangers, of dignity upheld and faith restored. Neither spoke. No words were needed to mark this moment when solitude finally gave way to belonging. Dawn crept over the Colorado highlands, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. For the first time in weeks, the storm clouds had retreated, leaving behind a sky as clear as spring water. The morning air held that special stillness that comes after long storms, crisp, clean, and full of promise. Maggie Keene stood on her cabin porch, drawing in a deep breath of the mountain air. Her shawl wrapped snugly around her shoulders, protection against the lingering winter chill. The transformed landscape before her sparkled like diamond dust, unmarred by tracks or trouble. Fresh snow draped every branch and fence post, nature's way of marking a new beginning. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open. Dale's boots made familiar sounds on the wooden planks as he stepped out, his arms laden with freshly split firewood. The morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair, and his breath formed small clouds in the cold air. He set the wood down carefully, each piece placed with the same quiet consideration he brought to all his tasks. Together they stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher above the ridgeline. Light spilled across the valley, setting the snow ablaze with brilliance. A lone eagle circled overhead, its wings catching the golden rays. Even the usually bitter wind seemed gentler today, carrying the promise of spring beneath its winter breath. Maggie's hands rested on the porch railing, her fingers tracing patterns in the fresh snow. The wood beneath was smooth from years of similar moments, Dawns faced alone, seasons marked in solitude. But this morning felt different. The silence between them held warmth instead of emptiness. "Strange how things change," Maggie said. Softly, her voice barely louder than the whisper of pine needles in the breeze. She turned slightly toward Dale, though her eyes remained on the horizon. "You know, when I told you that first night that no man had touched me since 1850, I never thought—" She paused, gathering her thoughts like precious things. "I never thought I'd want that to change." Dale remained still, giving her words the space they deserved. The only sound was the distant call of a mourning dove and the subtle settling of the cabin's timbers in the warming air. "But here we are," Maggie continued, her voice growing stronger. "And I need to tell you something." She turned fully to face him now, her eyes clear and direct. "No man's touched me since 1850, until now, and I'm glad it was you." The words hung in the crystal morning air like a benediction. Dale's expression softened, his eyes holding hers with gentle understanding. He knew the courage it took for her to speak those words, to open the door she'd kept locked for so many years. "I'll be here, Maggie," he answered softly, his voice carrying all the quiet strength she'd come to trust. "You'll never face the winter alone again." The promise settled around them like a warm blanket. Maggie felt tears prick at her eyes, but they weren't the bitter tears of loneliness she'd known for so long. These were different, lighter, healing tears that washed away the last shadows of those empty years. A chickadee landed on the nearby fence post, shaking snow from the weathered wood. Its cheerful morning song seemed to underscore the moment, nature itself celebrating this gentle dawn. The sun had climbed higher now, setting the icicles along the eaves to sparkling. Dale reached out slowly, offering his hand. Maggie took it without hesitation, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. His palm was warm against hers, calloused from honest work, steady as the mountains themselves. Together, they turned toward the cabin door. Inside, the banked fire waited to be stirred to new life, its warm glow visible through the window. Dale opened the door, and lamplight spilled out onto the snow, creating a golden pathway before them. They stepped inside, where the familiar scents of wood smoke and coffee welcomed them home. The door closed behind them with a soft click, sealing their promise within its sturdy walls. The cabin that had once stood as a monument to solitude now held something far more precious: the quiet miracle of found family, faith restored, and second chances fulfilled. Through the window, sunshine continued to pour across the Colorado highlands, blessing the day with light and hope. The long winter was ending, not just outside, but in their hearts as well. Spring would come again to the mountains, as it always did, but this time it would find two souls warming by the same fire, sharing the same dream. Their lonely seasons, finally, past. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.